First of all, I'm sorry about the message about getting all of the stuff done in week one. Some of you responded immediately and let me know that I had sent that to the wrong class. And you reminded me that I needed to change the color of this class on my dashboard because I had two green ones. You guys in the other class, which is an online class, which moves really fast, and they have work divided up, mostly stuff they do on their own, but week by week by week, and it only lasts 8 weeks. So anyway, sorry if I alarmed anyone. My bad. And so, second thing, and I guess this is about as good as I'm going to get the screen. What I have for you here, and I don't show a lot of video, but I wanted to show you this one. David Hockney's Secret Knowledge. And the reason I want to show it to you is that Hockney himself looks at much of the work that we'll look at in this class, and he analyzes it and tries to figure out how they did what they did. And so I'm going to leave it at that. When we get done, we'll talk about it and start on the early Renaissance. And so I need to.
By Lorenzo Lotto, I think it's 1545.
Well, guys, that's about half of it. I'm going to have it up on the media gallery if you want to watch the second half of it. But we've seen actually enough, I think, to actually be able to start to talk about the issue here. And the issue is, how do artists do what they do? How many of you, I'm about ready to sneeze, sneeze again? Yeah, thank you. And art is nothing to sneeze at, I'm telling you. But what I wanted to say about this is, how many of you been brought up with this kind of idea that artists have this natural gift, that you have a talent for doing this? And how many of you gotten that? That was really how I was brought up too. And I could draw, and so that was kind of a big deal. Wow, brothers and sisters can't do this. He must have talent. And I think that I don't want to discount the idea of talent, to be sure, because you have to have the eye, you have to have the hand-eye coordination. I think probably more than anything else, you have to have the critical thinking skills to know how to look at something to be able to do what you do. Now, that being said, at the beginning of this film, Hockney said he looked at all of this Western art. Many of those paintings are in the textbook. I mean, probably about 85%. Goes all the way back 1420, this is when things changed. Then, as he said, I started looking at this and wondering how they did this and why the change occurred. And so he starts figuring out, using his critical thinking skills, that it wasn't just sitting there in front of your subject matter and starting to draw, that they used what he leans on quite a bit here, the camera obscura, which is really a phenomenon. If we closed off, if I could get a light block over here and put a little hole, the light that shined through onto this wall would be the image of what's outside. It works like that. When there's a small hole that light passes through, it's just a phenomenon. That's a phenomenon of your eyes. And you saw that those images are upside down. Well, when light passes through your eyes, actually the image is upside down. Except your mind knows how to correct it, and you make sense of it ever since you were baby, ever since your whole life. But bottom line is that they used mechanical means to do what they did. Now, it said it started in 1420, and he said most art historians go with that date. To notice when our textbook starts, 1400, because there is a shift. There is a shift from doing things by hand to doing things using what was and is technology. Why did he have to do all of this research to figure this out? No guesses. I'll tell you why I had to do the research. Because this was like high-tech patent trade secrets. I don't know if you guys keep up with the smartphone wars, and it's kind of died down more in recent years, but there had been lawsuits filed from Samsung versus Apple. And you stole my idea, you do this, whatever. And the idea being that when somebody like Apple creates a new version, the Apple 14, they do that through research, and they keep that information protected. They don't share that with the world. That was the same thing going on here. What you were seeing here in the art was 15th century high tech, which I thought was kind of an interesting move on Hockney's part to kind of show you his Hollywood studio set. And as along the way, he would have probably be talking more about CGI, computer generated graphics. How many of you who have worked with computers kind of heard, gotten some shade thrown at you because you're using the computer and that's not really art? You guys get that? Yes, no, yes, Emma said yes. Well, here's what I say. And I think people who are really kind of aware of the history, artists have always used whatever technology was available to them. It was interesting that Hockney in the beginning showed you a very early film of a train pulling into the station. You saw that. That was like kind of a watershed moment. That piece of film was done at Thomas Edison Studios in New Jersey. And in fact, Edison made a lot of early short, silent, black and white movies. But that changed the game. All of a sudden, as Hockney said, painters didn't own images. Artists didn't own images as such. It was the camera. And today, it's really the computer that owns the images. And so that is the stuff that he showed you. He was in Brancacci Chapel in Florence, looking at the Masaccio work. And he was talking about how this was something like from Disneyland. Do you remember we said that? Well, it was 15th century IMAX is what it was. And so in a lot of ways, I want you to kind of know this too, because that is really movies, motion pictures, and video on the internet and stuff, however you get it. That has really kind of replaced what artists did 400, 500, 600 years ago. And as Hockney said, if you control the images, you wield a lot of power. And so a lot of the stuff that we'll look at early on will be work commissioned by the church, because the church, mostly the church, wielded the power. And we'll start to see the rise of wealthy individuals, an upper class not of the church, and so on. But we can kind of trace a lot of things by looking at the work. Hockney kind of focused in on how they did it. We'll focus in on how they did it. But we'll talk about some other issues as well. So, I put this slide up. You guys been looking at it? Mona Lisa, we talked about that last week, you know, and this is kind of, I'm not sure about this. I got that from some kind of Google search, but the most valuable painting in history surely must be the Mona Lisa, considered priceless. And they talk about this being worth $860 million. That may or may not be true. Actually, I think if it went on sale, it would get 5 or 10 times that. It would be like $10 billion, maybe. You know, with the way some of these folks have money, I mean, like Bezos and Elon Musk and some of the others, they could burn 10 billion for this. Anyway, but that's why it was considered most important for a long time. And a lot of what we look at least almost the whole book, but a lot of the works that we'll see are considered to be the most valuable works of those periods. And there are people, art historians, critics, people who study the arts, they call that an economic criticism. You decide how good a work of art is by how much it would get on the open market. That doesn't really explain everything, but that is one kind of way to evaluate a work of art. And so let's start here, basically where where Hockney started. And he was talking about Italy. He was talking about this area. There's Bruges and Ghent, those up in Flanders, and this Florence he was talking about. Basically Western Europe. And to kind of put this in perspective, it says, and the Holy Roman Empire, which is kind of this big, large area. One of the things about why would these people up here in Haarlem, Amsterdam, Ghent, Bruges, these are called the Low Countries. This is modern day Belgium, and that's the Netherlands. But actually, the Dutch Empire spanned much of the globe. And you can see these are right there. That's the area I'm talking about. But in the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries, they were right there, even though they're a tiny little part of Europe, they were right there with France, Spain, and England in colonizing the rest of the world. So they made a lot of money. They were powerful. They didn't have a large population, but you see some of this over here. New York. The Dutch own New York. You guys ever heard of that? Oh, well, as the story goes, the Dutch bought the island of Manhattan, modern day, big time New York. They bought it from the native people they traded some beads for the island. Kind of wanted some of the folklore of colonization, and probably the best real estate deal anybody had ever made. But at any rate, the Dutch, they were pretty influential. And so anyway, I broke down chapter 20 and wanted to kind of look at sculpture, painting, printmaking, architecture individually. And so 1396, 1406, Klaus Schluter, the Well of Moses. Let me zoom in on this because this is really quite remarkable. All of the things that Hockney talked about, the folds, the drapery, having an idea of the form under the cloth, stuff like that. Is he doing that? Is this pretty realistic, naturalistic, believable? It looks correct. Well, I think it does. I hope you think it does too. And to my point is that sculpture is hard. Any of you sculptors here? No, it's hard. It's hard, especially if you're doing lifelike sorts of images. It's extremely hard. And this stuff is limestone, and it said painted and gilded by Jean Lequel. Anyway, bottom line, this was all painted at one time, as were most sculptures, even going back to ancient Rome, those and ancient Greece, those were all painted. And what we have left is really the limestone or the marble. But bottom line, those are to zoom in on this. Sculpture is hard, but it's kind of easy in the sense that you can make it three-dimensional because it's a three-dimensional object. The stuff that Hockney was talking about are the problems of making the illusion of three dimensions on a two-dimensional surface. So for a long time here, this whole century or so, we're going to see sculpture kind of run ahead of painting. in terms of naturalism and in terms of believability. And so the well of Moses, I want to see these things here. Can you see that? What's that? What the heck? Right there and right there. I can't go on unless you tell me what it is. Horns. Horns. That's Moses, not the devil. This is a common practice. This will be true for about 100 and so years. What they were doing at this time was that they were going back, both up here in France, in Bruges, in the Netherlands, in Belgium, in Italy, all of these places. We're going back to the ancient text, the original text of the Bible. And from the time of Constantine, where he gathered all of these religious scholars and tried to gather up all of the books of the Bible in a place called Nicene. If you're Catholic, you'll know about the Nicene Creed. That's where that comes from. Bottom line, they had all of these texts, most of which were in Old Greek. And the word for halo and horns were misinterpreted. And so the Old Greek said that Moses had a halo, but they interpreted it as Moses with horns. And this will persist. You'll see even Michelangelo, 100 years after this, does a sculpture of Moses, and he has horns. One of the quirky things. Anyway, a lot of the sculpture of the time, this is like I have here, connected to a column, connected to a portal wall. And sculpture, by and large, was kind of decorative. Was the three-dimensional work on, was something on architecture. And so this is called an altarpiece, and you can see basically it's wood and it folds up. That folds to the center, this folds to the center. So what the heck? An altarpiece. Why did they have that? Well, it can be explained by the population distribution of the 14th, 15th centuries, and especially in a place like France, had a couple of large cities, Chartres, Paris, so on, but the whole country was Catholic. The whole country had to say mass, go to mass every Sunday, as good Catholics do. And so they made these altar pieces to travel around from village to village, and they would say mass with this in the background. It would turn an ordinary building into a church. And so, like most of the sculpture of the time, you can see this actually looks like it's decorating a wall. It's kind of almost three-dimensional, but kind of still frontal. And like a lot of these, like almost all of them, they tell a story. Now, why would you need images to tell a story back in these days? Here's another altarpiece, the death and assumption of the Virgin. Tells a story. Krakow, Holy Roman Empire. Why would you need these things to tell a story? Could it have something to do with low literacy rate? And the fact that books were pretty scarce. This is before the invention of the printing press. And so all of the Bibles that were in circulation were transcribed by hand, and typically by monks in a monastery, and that's what they did 24/7, was create handwritten calligraphic Bibles. And so anyway, at church, they would do Bible readings from the priest. They would do a homily, to be sure, but you got the gospel readings, and then you got the other readings from the Old Testament, and this would help explain the religion. And another altarpiece, Assumption of the Virgin, Germany, Poland, France. This is just right across Europe. This is a little later. This is the late 15th century. And the craft of these, all of this sculpture is quite incredible. And I think that when Hockney, was talking about those paintings, he was quite taken by the amount of skill it took to make these, even though we're talking about camera obscura and all of these things that they did to make the images correct. Still remarkable amount of skill. And so, yeah, you can see this is lime. Here, wood, the rest, yeah, so. Oops. Okay, this is the point. Heightened realism, architectural, and still basically two-dimensional because you can only see it from the front. Right attached to it is a wall or a column or a portal or something. But that was bless you, sculpture. You got it from me. See, I think this window is like the old. So painting, and here it is, the illusion of three-dimensional space on a two-dimensional surface. And what you have to know is that for the first 350 years, 400 years of the time that we study in this book in European art, the emphasis, one of the foci, one of the main concerns of the artist was realism. It was this mad rush. Now, Hockney didn't really go into why things were the way they were before. He said, look at this Byzantine Christ and a Van Gogh, which is pronunciation for Van Gogh, you see. Bottom line, why why did everything change at that time? And we'll talk about that here in a while, but everything before that was flat. Everything before that was not real. It did not look realistic, naturalistic, or photographic, as he said. And so what we'll study here for a while, at least in the 15th and early 16th century, is how they did that. And I showed you the camera obscura argument and the technology. There's another thing that they did too. Can you guys tell what I did here with my eye pen? What is this? Not talking, eh? We got way. All right. How about if I give you a clue? Vanishing point. You see how those lines all converge on the horizon? This is 1 point perspective. Gabriel did that shape. Yeah, and that's one of the first things they teach you, I think, when you get in drawing class. It's a mathematical proposition. It kind of takes into consideration how we see as human beings. We perceive that things get smaller as they are more distant. That's the way our eyes work. And if you're going to create the illusion of three-dimensional on a two-dimensional surface, this is one way to create depth. Linear perspective. And so here's what's happening here, though. Exquisite surface detail. And this is from Roger van der Weyden, and he was a contemporary of Van Eyck that we saw with Man with the Red Turban and stuff, and the chandelier that Hockney was all on about. 1 point perspective. And here's another one, 1399. This is right when we're getting that change, but you see these lines. They go back into the distance. One thing about early linear perspective, though, this is actually pretty correct. It's from 1435. You go 35 years prior to that, they knew there was something going on with perspective, but they hadn't figured it out mathematically. They didn't have a system. They didn't figure the horizon line, the vanishing point, the multiple vanishing points, the stuff that you guys learned in drawing one. And so what you call this here is approximate perspective. And that is that they know things recede, and they know that that a front edge of this structure would be the tallest, and it would get smaller into the background, but they didn't really have a method. And the method was, at least in theory, at least by some historical accounts, that was figured out in Italy by an architect. A guy named Brunelleschi was supposed to have figured out linear perspective, at least 1 point perspective. And so anyway, but here we go. This is the St. Luke and the Virgin. St. Luke drawing the Virgin. Hey, how many Catholics? No, I can't ask you that. I'm Catholic, I'll tell you. Who is the patron saint of physicians, doctors? We got the hospital right across the street, St. Luke's. St. Luke was a doctor. He was a physician. And at least in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, they credit St. Luke with being an artist as well. And that's why we have him drawing the Virgin here. He's an artist, got a sketchbook out. Of course, if this makes sense, you really study the Bible, you really know about the history. Luke was a disciple. In this picture, Jesus is a baby. Chronology out the window. It was more important for them to illustrate that Luke, he is actually the patron saint of artists too. Physicians, patron saint of artists. So, but at any rate, we got this. We got this. You see a theme here? There's my secret knowledge. There's a link to it. And there's the camera obscura I was talking about. Here it is. Linear perspective. Horizon line, vanishing point, and all parallel lines converge at the vanishing point. 1 point, linear perspective. So have you seen a kind of a theme this far? It's all religious artwork. I want to take an aside. Change the subject here a little bit. I don't know if any of you are familiar with this, but David Crosby passed away last week, Friday, I guess. You guys know him. Part of group is 81. Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young. In my other class, in the 100 online class, one of my colleagues put on this video. It's from the early days of MTV. And Neil Young, a collaborator, colleague of David Crosby, made this video, and his song is "This Note's for You," where he is actually rebelling against all of the corporate sponsorship of music, and especially at MTV when that came out. Corporations were like all over it because they would sell young people products and stuff. And his whole song is about his music is for everyone. It's not for Pepsi. It's not for Coke. It's not for Budweiser. It's not for whatever. So what he's talking about is that kind of sponsorship. And that's the point why my colleague put that video in that course. You can see it here. We've only seen maybe a dozen slides, and it's all religious. Who controls the art? The church. The church is really the only entity, at least for this short period of time, that had the money and the power to commission artwork. Period. You don't find much. And as we move on through the Renaissance, we'll start to see the emergence of non-religious art. I showed you the Mona Lisa, not religious. Of course, that was 1505. We're still around 1400. We'll see that change. We'll see that change over time. And part of that change has to do with the advent of a new philosophy that starts to take over in Europe. Religion Christianity, the Catholic Church, still supreme in terms of wealth, in terms of authority. I showed you the map. The Holy Roman Empire was the biggest part of Central Europe, still governed directly or indirectly by the Pope. But we start to see a new philosophy, humanism. And I showed you Klaus Schluter, excuse me, and how he interpreted the old Greek version of the Bible, the old Greek version of the Old Testament, and put horns on Moses. Well, you see, they were starting to do this all over Europe. And not all of it was Christian. They started uncovering a lot of art that was produced by the ancient Greeks and Romans. And as they were searching around for old copies of the Bible, they were also finding works by Aristotle and Plato and some of the great Galen, the physician, mathematicians, Euclid, and so on. They were finding out a lot of stuff, knowledge and art that had been lost to history. And that kind of starts to gain traction. And it takes about 100 years for it to fully develop. But all of a sudden, you got a competing set of ethics, of information, a competing set of knowledge. And that knowledge from the ancients was scientifically based. At this time, we still have these things, these stories about how in the 17th century, Galileo, you guys know Galileo, the telescope figured out that there were planets revolving or rotating, revolving around the sun. Copernicus figured out the solar system. That was all based on stuff that was developed out of ancient Greek and Roman knowledge. You hear these stories, and this is a lot of this is folklore, to be sure of it. The idea that most of the Europeans thought, as it was said in the Bible, that the earth was the center of the universe and that the sun went around the earth. The scientists proved it. The scientists figured out, based on the work of the ancient Greeks, that the world earth was round, not flat. We're, we're seeing a time, as Hockney showed you, the changes in technology and how that affected art and image making, but the whole culture is changing. And it's coming out of what they call the Middle Ages, some call the Dark Ages, coming out of the Black Plague, which was a 14th century disaster. People were rethinking everything, how to make art, and what is the nature of our existence and our. So, with that said, Wednesday, there's supposed to be a snowstorm. I'll tell you what I can do. if you agree to it. If it's snowing and it looks like it's gonna be hazardous on the road. For those of you who commute. I'll send out something, we'll figure it out. They've been predicting snowstorms that never materialize, but bottom line. Wednesday morning, I'll send out an announcement. We're gonna have class here, or if we just do it on Zoom. I'm asking you this right now because if it does snow. Would Zoom be a problem for any of? A lot of you guys I know have been. Okay, well, look for an announcement. I'll let you know either way. And with that. See you later. And just a reminder, there's that chandelier he was talking about. I don't know what YouTube page. Bye.